Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started. Welcome to episode 16. What exactly is organic wine? And is it better for you? That's what we're talking about on today's episode. But before we get started, I'd like to give a shout out to Les Payne from California, who emailed me about episode 14, which was entitled Bottle of the Sexes, Men versus Women on Wine. If you missed that one, go back and have a listen, as it'll definitely provoke discussion between you and your wine-loving friends. Les says, quote, I don't know how to characterize guy versus gal wines. However, that being said, my wife and I have very different taste buds. We can share a cab and have two very different experiences. I love big reds and can be drinking a Barolo, and she says I can barely taste as it takes the enamel off my teeth. Love the podcast. I spend a lot of time traveling in my car, so it makes the trips enjoyable. End quote. I am so glad you're enjoying the podcast while you're traveling around, Les. Cheers. I love to share reviews of this podcast for those of you kind enough to post them, especially on Apple Podcasts, social media, or email. If you want me to mention your website or social media handle, please include that in your review along with your name. I want to celebrate you and let others know how to connect with you online. Earth Hour is March 30th and Earth Day, April 22nd. Naturally, you might think about pouring yourself a glass of organic wine to celebrate. But what is organic wine? And how is it different from inorganic wine? Is that even a thing, inorganic wine? I don't think so. Anyway, back in the 1970s, the concept of organic wine conjured up images of ponytailed vintners in tie-dyed t-shirts, producing wines more for ideology than taste. Thankfully, those days are just a watery memory now. Today, organic wines are no longer just for health nuts and tree huggers. Wine lovers drink them for their quality. They've gone mainstream and represent one of the fastest growing categories in the liquor store. Getting into the mainstream required settling some key issues, and that story reveals as much about contemporary life as it does about organic wines. Until the 1950s, most grapes grown for wine, like most crops of all kinds then, were organic. That is, they were grown without using any synthetic pesticides or fertilizers. This often meant that crops were at the mercy of diseases and pests, and farmers had no choice but to wait until Mother Nature recalibrated itself after the blight died out with its food source, the crop. Then along came the so-called Green Revolution, and the chemicals perceived as the modern and progressive way to farm. They seemed to offer problem-free fields without destroying the crops. For 2 decades or so, these intensive and expensive interventions ruled agriculture in North America and around the world. The backlash started with the Back to the Land movement of the 1970s. Consumers worried about the domination of big business, about harm to the environment, and the long-term effects of chemicals used to produce food and drink. Scientists now believe that all such substances accumulate in our bodies, and since they've only been used for several decades, we don't know yet the full long-term effects. These factors, together with a yearning for self-sufficiency of the hippie culture, strengthened the public desire for natural foods. Modern food concerns since then, genetically modified foods, mercury poisoning, mad cow disease, E. coli, fast food, and obesity, have all contributed to the momentum. So, what is organic wine? Many foods are described as organic nowadays, but what does it actually mean when applied to wine? Making wine is a two-step process. First, you grow the grapes, then you make the wine. That means there's a difference between wine from organically grown grapes and organic wine. Grapes that are grown organically must have no synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, fungicides, or soil fumigants used on them. So, do organic wines use chemicals or not? The concept that organic grapes are grown without chemicals is a little misleading. All wine grapes use some form of chemicals in farming. The difference is that organics use chemicals derived from naturally occurring materials. For example, most organic wine growers use sulfur to control powdery mildew, and so do conventional growers. The only difference is that the formulations of sulfur used by organic farmers are approved by the federal government, whereas the sulfur used by conventional growers can be any sulfur. In both cases, these materials are pesticides. It's true that all synthetic pesticides and fertilizers are synthesized, which requires energy. However, organically approved sulfur dust is mined, which also consumes a lot of energy. Most synthetic sulfur dust is a byproduct of petroleum distillation. There's still a debate over whether organic wines are allowed to be irrigated with gray water, which is partially treated wastewater. Purists also nix the use of genetically modified vines and growth hormones. To qualify for the organic designation, the farm or vineyard must be free of synthetic chemicals for a certain period as determined by a governmental agency, such as the Canadian Food Inspection Agency. This varies by country, but 3 years is the common length of time for the soil to be declared free of most chemical residue. Organic wine takes the no chemical use step further. It means that not only were the grapes grown organically, but the wine itself was made with none of the 500 available additives or agents. So who defines what's organic? Well, this is a confusing subject because different winemaking regions use different definitions, and several organizations provide a number of different certifications. For example, the California Certified Organic Farmers Organization inspects and certifies member growers according to its own standards, which are more stringent than those in the California Organic Food Act of 1979. Many producers are advocating a single set of international standards which would help consumers to understand and trust the organic designation. So, what do organic vintners use then instead of synthetic chemicals? In their quest to enrich the soil and keep pests at bay, many vintners interplant the vine rows with other crops, such as ryegrass, chicory, fescue, oats, mustard, lupins, and red clover. These cover crops control weeds and encourage bugs to feed on them rather than on the vines. They can also be plowed back into the soil to replenish its nitrogen. Some organic winemakers also add compost made from pumice, the solid material left over from pressing the grapes. Some vintners allow chickens the run of their vineyards, since they both eat bugs and scratch the soil, naturally tilling it. Others build nesting boxes and perches to encourage hawks and owls to roost and hunt rodents and other pests in the vineyard. This can be surprisingly effective. Doug Price, viticulturalist at the California winery Clos du Bois, once laid out a tarp under one of 30 owl boxes he built around his vineyard. Over the course of one summer, it collected more than 500 gopher skulls. Oy. Featherstone Vineyards in Niagara uses lamb mowers to reduce their environmental hoof print. The spring lambs eat the low-hanging leaf canopy of the vines, as well as the grasses growing between the vineyard rows. So, are organic wines really better for you? The good news about even non-organic wine grapes is that far fewer chemicals are used on them than on other fruit. Consumers want strawberries and pears to look good on fruit stands, so they ignore the chemicals that keep them that way, even to the detriment of taste and health. However, the appearance of wine grapes is irrelevant since they're going to be crushed. As a result, they're grown specifically to optimize their taste only. Still, there are 17 chemicals commonly used in vineyards today, and grapes aren't washed before being crushed. That means non-organic fruit may have trace amounts of chemicals, but many winemakers purport that the process of fermentation neutralizes such residues, and filtering the finished wine usually removes whatever might remain. Federal law stipulates that there cannot be any chemical residue in finished wine, organic or not. The science on this, though, is still pending. However, University of California at Davis studies note differences in the internal chemistry of fruits and vegetables between those that have preventative prophylactic sprays applied to them when known insect infestations would occur than those that did not have sprays. The unsprayed plants produced significantly more compounds related to the immune systems of those plants, the ones that we also value as human antioxidants, including phenolic compounds and flavonoids. There's really no evidence that organic wine is any better for you than non-organic, or that it will reduce your risk of cancer, heart disease, or other illnesses. Certainly, though, those employees working on an organic farm or winery are less exposed to the chemicals that can cause these diseases. So, does an organic wine cause fewer hangovers? Sadly, no. The only cause of a hangover is drinking too much alcohol. Organic wine won't make your hangover less severe. How is organic wine different from vegan wine? It's all in the clarifying, the removal of the particles which create cloudiness. Some vintners skip this step because they believe it can strip the wine of some of its character. One of the traditional ways of fining wine is to add whisked egg whites to the barrels of fermenting wine. As these settle through the liquid, they bond with particles and eventually float back to the top where the vintner scoops them out. Organic wines allow the use of whites of organic eggs, but not vegan wines. Vegan wines also don't use clarifying substances in the trade like gelatin, blood, skim milk, and fish bladders in favor of certain types of clay like bentonite, centrifuge machines, or cellulose filters. Another method is simply to allow the wine a longer time in barrel so that any particles settle naturally at the bottom and can be left behind when the wine is drained into the bottles. Does organic wine taste better? In blind taste tests, many experts perceive no difference between well-made organic and non-organic wines. Many winemakers themselves certainly believe that their wines are more complex when the grapes are organically farmed. That process demands careful, hands-on attention to matters such as canopy management when the growers prune back leaves to create better air circulation among grape bunches so that there's less chance of rot. And in the words of Randall Graham, owner of California's Bonnie Doon Vineyards, quote, "Our vision must go beyond taste. We have to ask, what are the costs of chemical codependency? Does our business advance values that we esteem? Are we making a product that customers want to buy?" End quote. I believe that wine is an expression of the earth in which the vines grow. If that earth is rich and alive rather than a chemical wasteland, that's got to affect the wine, even if the difference is subtle. How about you? Do you try to buy organic wine? If so, which ones? Do you perceive any taste differences? Share that with me, please. You can tag me on Twitter or Facebook at Natalie McLean, and on Instagram, I'm at Natalie McLean Wine. You'll find links to my reviews of organic wines that are in store now in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/16. Next week, we'll chat with Thomas Balchador, the rockstar winemaker who produces organic and biodynamic wines in Niagara, Oregon, and Burgundy. He's a former journalist and knows how to tell a great story. If you like this episode, please tell a friend about it. My podcast is easy to find, whether you search on its name, Unreserved Wine Talk, or my name. I can't wait to share more personal stories with you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this one. I hope something great is in your glass this week. You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.